Hello, I'm Brian Sibley, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this very special Waterstones event celebrating the 40th anniversary of the publication of J.R.R. Tolkien's Unfinished Tales of Numenor and Middle-earth, as edited by the writer's son, Christopher Tolkien. Thanks to Christopher's insightful curation of his father's stories, Unfinished Tales gave striking new insights into the three ages of Middle-earth, and in particular those stories with which readers were already familiar from The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and The Silmarillion, making it a landmark volume in our appreciation of Tolkien and his literary creation. Well, now Unfinished Tales is republished in a splendid new edition from HarperCollins, as you've never seen the book before, because it is embellished with illustrations. There are 18 of them, and they are all in full color. Here's an example. Here's a picture of the Numenorians setting sail for Middle-earth. As you can see, very striking rock formations. We'll be talking about that in a little while on the beach, and below the fleet itself with lowering storm clouds in the background. There's also a trio of delicate pencil sketches, we're going to see one of them now, which demark the three sections of the book itself. And here is Isildur, the Gondorian king who indeed cut the ring from Sauron's hand and started the whole saga that's recounted in The Lord of the Rings. Let's look at the cover of this book. You would have seen it on the opening card at the beginning of this presentation. This was one of the last Tolkien publishing projects to be sanctioned by Christopher Tolkien prior to his death earlier this year at the age of 95. Well, to talk about the book, I'm delighted to be joined by the triumvirate of artists whose work will already be familiar to every Tolkien aficionado and which now adorn Unfinished Tales, as well as many other books. Here they are having worked together on a Tolkien project for the very first time, and a rare occasion, I think, for all of them to be at a Tolkien event with one another. Let's meet John Howe, Alan Lee, and Ted Nasmith. Hi guys, welcome.
Hello everybody.
Here's Brian. Good to see you too. This is wonderful.
Well, it's great to be with you all. And let's have a quick word with each. John, let's talk about, our moderator at Waterstones will click back to it for us to have a look at the beach scene that I was mentioned a few moments ago. Tell me where this comes from, because this looks like a totally unlikely piece of landscape.
It is a totally unlikely piece of landscape, but it is a real landscape. It's a place called Three Sisters Beach near New Plymouth in New Zealand, and I visited last year. A very, very exceptional place where the high tide comes right into the cliffs twice a day. So there's no intertidal zone, and you have to visit it during the low tide, rather. So you must race in, run around, look, and back out before the water comes back in. And on the way back out, there were places where the water was up to my waist. If you stay there, you stay there forever. But it's a very, very beautiful, like all of New Zealand, a very, very beautiful place. And I was looking for an excuse to put it in something, and there we are.
And these rock sentinels that we see there,
I actually added quite a few, but the feel of the place is very much like that.
Right.
It's really one of these extraordinary coastlines of New Zealand that is windswept and nothing but mineral and water.
Well, it's a wonderful image, and great to have it in the book. Alan, we were talking, well, there's some ships here that John has contributed. You've provided the ships that are on the cover of the book. There isn't a lot to go on, I assume, when we're talking about Numenorian vessels. So where do you get your inspiration?
Well, I was just very curious about what they would look like. So I just tried to draw them to find out for myself what, because you get quite a strong impression from just a few words that Tolkien uses to describe them as their height, their many masts, and their kind of, sense of glorious, huge seagoing vessels that can explore all the far reaches of Middle-earth. And yeah, so I just wanted to kind of, didn't have a clear picture in my mind, so I just wanted to kind of explore it, and came up with those images.
Well, they wrap around the book very nicely, I must say. So thank you for that. And Ted, I thought we might just mention here that when you were quite a young man, I'm not sure how old, but you actually corresponded with Professor Tolkien, and indeed he saw some of your early ideas for artwork. Not obviously not the work at the same kind of level that you are now working at, but he did see some of your early work.
Yes. And I was actually 17 at the time. I was just graduating from high school from the art course there, and I had discovered Tolkien about a year before that or so. And so I gathered up a few photographs of the first couple of pieces of art I'd done. One called The Unexpected Party. It was done in gouache, which I've used ever since. And he actually wrote back to me. I was very excited about that, through his correspondence secretary, and praised what I had done. The comment that stood out was that my version of Bilbo seemed a bit too much like a child, which I quickly, understood what he meant, and worked to, get the hobbits right from then on, and I have pursued that ever since. But yes, it was absolutely a wonderful inspiration for me at that point in time, and certainly spurred me forward.
I do love the fact that Tolkien was so willing to engage with people who had their own creative interpretation. I know they weren't always ones with which he agreed, but nevertheless, I think right from the beginning, he saw, well, fairly quickly anyway, that what he was creating was something which would go on being recreated or embodied in other people's creations, and
Yes.
Embrace that, which is great. Well, we're going to be talking together, the four of us, for a while, and on the way, John, Alan and Ted will each be showing us and talking about a couple of their illustrations for this new edition of Unfinished Tales. And then later in the event, there'll be a chance for you who are viewing to put your questions to my guests via the Q&A facility, which is on the bottom of your Zoom screen. You will see it there. One person has already asked a question, so put them there and I'll get around to them a little bit later. But first, let's begin by talking about this book. It was first published in 1980. I remember it well. I was working on a radio version of The Lord of the Rings for the BBC, and I was very anxious to see this book and see what new material I might uncover. And indeed, I did uncover the fact that Gollum was tortured in Barad-dûr to reveal what he knew about the ring. It was little information other than the name of Baggins, but it did, of course, lead the Black Riders to the Shire. And I embodied this in the very first episode of the 26 parts serialization, only to be pulled up by listeners who wrote in and said, it's only the first episode and Brian Sibley's already making stuff up. Well, I wasn't, of course, and Christopher Tolkien had approved the scripts and was aware of the fact that I was interpolating this scene from Unfinished Tales. But I remember that publication and the eagerness with which I sought it. But it came out 3 years after the publication of the Silmarillion. And it might have been thought on the surface to be perhaps a somewhat unpromising venture, really, because not just because of the title. I mean, who wants to read Unfinished Tales? But also because the book's editor was pretty cagey about the content. It must be said at once, Christopher Tolkien wrote, that much in the book will be found unrewarding by readers of The Lord of the Rings. Well, little did he know. That could not have proved other than absolutely wrong. And within 3 years, Christopher was publishing the first book of his 12-volume series, The History of Middle-earth, and giving us more and more information and background to his father's creation. Let's find out how our three artists first encountered this particular book and what they made of it. John, where did it begin for you?
I don't remember, honestly. I must have read it when it first came out. I know I was a bit late in actually getting the Silmarillion to read. partly because it was in hardback and I was a student at the time and couldn't afford a hardback. And but I did snap up Unfinished Tales. I found it incredibly riveting, with this quite astonishing combination of very high drama and very epic scope. So, you know, like everything of Tolkien, you get the impression that this is a vast world of which you are afforded, you know, a few tiny glimpses, and even more so in this case, because you realize with regret that he never really finished all these tales. So
yeah, it has a fascination. The three of you were talking with me online when we were preparing the 2021 Tolkien calendar, which features a number of pieces of the art from this book, about the fact that the book has this intriguing feeling of being rather like an old manuscript that's been recovered, you know, of which there's only fragments, like the Dead Sea Scrolls or something. So you're getting insights into fragments which actually somehow increase their potency, even though you don't necessarily have the whole story. How was it for you, Alan? Do you remember reading it for the first time?
Well, I really remember using it as a kind of reference book when we were starting to work on the films of the Lord of the Rings. But you're right about it being a way of thinking of the Lord of the Rings as just one part of a great mythology, and then you're finding these fragments, other versions of the stories that kind of that flesh it out and lead into kind of intriguing byways that just give you the sense of, you know, this isn't just a novel. This is you know, a whole kind of wealth of subjects to explore in many different ways.
You're nodding, Ted. You obviously agree with that.
Yes, indeed. It is. It seemed to perform a number of functions for an artist, but to remember how I first read it, I think I was struck because I had read the Silmarillion, but that in the story of Tuor, his coming to Gondolin, or the Narn with the fleshed out story of Turambar, you know, you got this amazing sense that, oh my goodness, there's so much more that was kind of skipped over in the shorter, briefer Silmarillion accounts. And so you understood that the potential epic novels that could have come out of fully detailed accounts, of which the Silmarillion was more of an introduction than anything. It was stunning. And it is such rich language. It is such a pleasure to read it again when I did this in 2018. So, you know, the story of Erendis and Eldarion in particular captured my imagination. Here was an intimate look at a Númenórean tale. You know, that was extraordinary. And it didn't matter so much that you know, you couldn't understand what the final sort of draft might have been or how it would have ended, but just the fact that you had this glimpse, like you're saying, like these fragments of old manuscripts, and I love that kind of interpretation of the whole thing.
Well, let's take a look at some of the illustrations in the book, and we're going to begin with two of Alan's pictures. The first of which, Alan, is this wonderful illustration, double illustration actually, of Amroth and Nimrodel, depicting the legend of the star-crossed lovers whose tryst and only hope of happiness is doomed when they're separated, and Amroth's ship is caught in a storm and he's lost, attempting to swim to shore in search of his love. You and John favour these double images, sometimes with you, Alan, working within one image within another, so there's kind of a background image. Can you tell me a little bit about this this style of creating imagery?
Well, it's for one thing, when you've got a portrait format, it doesn't always suit the composition that you have in mind for the subject. So having the option of just creating a little predella at the bottom, or you know, or a segment somewhere else, allows you to explore two aspects or more aspects of the story in one image. So here you've got essentially two things which are happening at the same time. As Nimrodel is kind of lost in the mountains, she'd stopped by the source of a stream which later bears her name. It's also called the Silver Lode, and she kind of loses her way, and she's unable to make her date with Amroth when they're going to depart in the elven ship. Then a great storm blows up, and the elves decide they have to leave, and Amroth just dives into the water and starts swimming towards the shore and is never seen again. So
Well,
we assume he's drowned.
There's so many fascinating things in this double image, Alan. The way in which the waterfall running down into the Silver Lode is kind of mirrored by the lightning flash that's coming down from the storm and hitting the ship and the sea. But this amazing underwater section right at the bottom, where we're almost as though we're looking through a tank, and we can see both, you know, above and below the waves at the same time. It's a very, very powerful and striking image.
I'm so happy that worked, because I've never tried anything quite like that before, and or maybe once. I think I did some Lorelei images beneath a waterfall, but it's yeah, I think it's a tricky thing to attempt, and I think it kind of works.
Well, I think you pulled it off brilliantly. The second illustration of yours, which we're just going to chat about, is this one, which is entitled "A Chance Meeting." And what you're depicting here is something which we don't read about in The Lord of the Rings, or indeed certainly not in The Hobbit, but in fact it informs exactly what happens in The Hobbit, which is the fact that Gandalf, returning to the Shire, meets with Thorin Oakenshield, and as a result of that meeting, persuades the dwarf to enlist burglar Bilbo on the quest for Erebor. I love the sense of chance, because there is in the picture here, you've got a feeling as though, you know, Gandalf's crossing the bridge, and I mean, in fact, in the text, I think it describes how he kind of races after, having met him, races after Thorin to put his plan to him. But of course, it's all framed within this glorious image of the bridge, the stone bridge, the waterfall, the trees. Tell me a little bit about what you were thinking when you were putting this together.
Well, it mentions that they met outside Bree,
Yeah.
near the source of a river, and Thorin had just overtaken Gandalf, and then we assumed he just kind of, Gandalf speaks to him and he turns, and Gandalf was surprised that Thorin wanted to chat with him, and yeah, so that begins this whole adventure of the ring and the hunt for the treasure and the quest for Erebor, and yeah, I just love the idea. It's just a chance meeting that sets off this whole chain of events.
And I think the fact that you frame it within a landscape rather than being close up to them is sort of, it enhances the idea of this is almost by chance. But it leads me to ask you a question about the whole business of doing authorized Tolkien illustrations, because you've been at the forefront of this since 1991, when you made the first illustrated edition, fully illustrated edition of The Lord of the Rings. But historically, the Tolkien estate has always preferred the official artist to focus, how can I put it, perhaps more on place than on people. Yeah. Do you think that's perhaps because Tolkien's own art, with very few exceptions, tended towards being mainly landscapes, structures, or sometimes even just emblematic decorations and nothing more?
Well, I think it's a wise decision to ask artists to kind of concentrate on the landscapes more than the characters, because I think you go more seriously wrong with you know, if you're focusing on a character and you don't quite capture it. I think very often in a way, we kind of inhabit the characters ourselves, or the reader does, and I feel I don't want to get too close to the characters pictorially. I want to kind of feel what they're like, you know, what they're thinking, and I don't need to know every single thing about what what they look like. So I try to kind of generalize the characters as much as possible, and really concentrate on creating the setting and the atmosphere and the landscape in which all these fantastic events are going to evolve.
John, I wonder whether that view of an illustrator's contribution changed, or maybe our reception of it has changed since the making of the Jackson films. Now, you and Alan were obviously very much involved in creating that imagery. Do you think that imagery that was created by the films has impacted on the visual imagination of the Tolkien reader? Are we now able to view art more easily, or indeed is it harder in a way because of those very, very strong film images?
I wonder if the films don't actually accomplish something quite different, in that they underline the permanence of a text and the transience of any visual interpretation. And personally, I was very, very struck and very much taken with all of the actors who, when they were, you know, fully made up and in their character and in their role, were actually almost a source of despair, because you realize you can never really render that in an illustration. And on the other hand, I'm personally drawn to very dramatic events. So that means that sometimes I feel the need to get closer to characters. On the other hand, the landscape itself is a character involved in dramatic events. So between the two, I think the main thing that I probably have retained from working on the movies is a special affection for landscape format. And I now find it very hard, as Alan did mention, to work a landscape into a portrait format. And I was overjoyed when Chris, I believe Alan, or maybe I can't remember if it was Alan or Ted, asked if it was possible for us to do occasional illustrations that would be in a landscape format, so the reader would have to turn the book on its side to see them. And Chris Smith, who is the editor, responded, yes, of course. So that was really a relief, because you feel like you're not doing justice to a real landscape if you've only got a small section of it.
Well, you turned several on their side, as it were, don't you, Ed? And we're going to be talking about a couple of them soon. But do you find the fact that there is so much Tolkien art out there? I'm very conscious. I've been following the Tolkien scene for so many years now. I'm very conscious that fan art, for example, which I remember as being very varied and very strikingly different from one another across the early years of kind of Tolkien fandom, has now settled into a kind of every Gandalf has to look like Ian McKellen, or actually rather like John or Alan's image of Gandalf. Do you find it restricting, or do you find it liberating?
I don't find it a problem particularly. I'm not sure if it's liberating so much as it's just good to have, I think, a good mixture of different interpretations and artists who, you know, are inspired like I was, and want to see, you know, how they can flesh out ideas and express the characters and so on. I suspect that, well, like I do know that a lot of the film art, film-inspired art, has been a big factor now. I prefer that, you know, people sort of read the book and use their own imaginations and things, but I don't, you know, I think it's kind of the more the merrier, basically. I know the kind of, you know, when I started out, it was just like, I want to express as much as possible my ideas and interpretations of the scenes. I felt it just needed a professional touch at that time, especially. And I seem to have formed a relationship with fans. And as far as I'm concerned, as long as people are interested in what I'm doing and appreciate it, I think I'm maturing as an artist as I go along as well. I take the same subjects that I've done years ago and sometimes reinterpret them. It may be a commission, or it just may be an opportunity to update something. And I find that's a very interesting exercise as well. It's just the pursuit of a level of perfection, or for me, you know, how I want to see the particular scene. And as to characters, and you know, I have done both types of interpretation where it's characters are way back in the midground or the background somewhere, very tiny against a large landscape. That's of course a perfectly reasonable idea. And I've often been inspired by great American landscape painters and European landscape painters who do this kind of thing. The figures are very small usually, and I thought that's very good for Tolkien. But at the same time, it is interesting to explore characters and their sort of expressions in a sort of personal way, and just give myself a bit more kind of leeway that way. When I illustrated A Game of Thrones a few years ago, one of the jobs was to do viewpoint characters for the chapters. And I took great pleasure in, you know, developing those faces and those, you know, the whole persona that I could capture. And I felt like, you know, a reasonable talent for it. It's not my primary kind of forte, but I worked hard at that, and I was very happy with how it came out, how that stuff came out. And sometimes I do apply that to Tolkien here and there, although his own descriptions are fairly limited, so that he does give you scope to just imagine them in different ways. You know, we had Boromir with the horns on his head for a long time there.
Absolutely. Well, indeed, yes. And sometimes that freedom allows the reader, of course, to interpret in their mind. I remember when the radio version came out, that people, well, at least one person wrote and said that Sir Robert Stevens, who played Aragorn in the radio version, didn't sound like Aragorn. And that tells you probably, I guess, how we all hear and see in our heads and imaginations what we read on the page. We're going to look at a couple of John's illustrations from Finished Tales now, and we're going to start with this one entitled The Hunt for the Ring. This is such a powerful image, John. The Black Rider looming over the unwitting rural landscape of the Shire. I love the way in which the figure is kind of stooped on the horse. The fact that the horse itself has a lowered head. There's everything about it suggests menace, and yet there's this beautiful bucolic scene in the background, which is, you know, idealistic and perfect. But everything on the left hand side of the picture, including the tree, all seems to be foreshadowing so much.
That's another New Zealand landscape, actually. And
It's not the location for Hobbiton, is it?
It's not far away.
All right, okay.
Not far away. And I spent a long time adjusting the silhouette of the Black Rider, and I remember fiddling with it and adding bits and subtracting bits and changing the horse's neck, and you know, it was quite a long process. But and then I had to do the tree, and once you start a tree, you've got to finish the tree. So I drew a very deep breath before I started those first leaves, because after that there's no going back. But I enjoyed doing that one, and once again, it is, you know, it is the kind of landscape that I really like.
And there is something about the horse and rider here that becomes almost one. It's almost impossible to differentiate where one begins and the other ends, and that's something I haven't seen you do in creating images of the riders. But
that's actually Camel the Easterling. You can see a little bit of Orientalist decoration on the horses, right, on his cloak, just along the edge. But
yes.
Once again, nothing that interferes, I hope, with the picture.
No. And the tail running down between the folds of the cloak. Now, your next image, which we're going to look at, tell me what we're looking at here. This is quite a different image, but trees again predominating. Tell me what we're seeing here, please.
That is one of the Druidane, who are quite well described by Tolkien, and we encounter them very briefly in Lord of the Rings. They are the ones who guide the army of Rohan through the back and hidden paths towards the Pelennor fields, and they apparently create stone images of themselves, which are as belligerent looking as they are. And the actual landscape is very close to where Alan lives, Wistman's Wood, which I'm sure Alan knows by heart. And it's one of those places that I had the good fortune to visit several years ago. And ever since, I've been looking for every excuse I can to put it in a picture somewhere. So mission accomplished.
Well, yes. And one of the amazing things, I've seen some of your photographs that you've taken, John, in Wistman's Woods in Devon, and what's fantastic about it is that the moss that's growing on the branches and the roots of these trees almost make them even more kind of serpentine and mobile and full of life than they would do if they were just plain wood, because they look as though they're on the move. They're absolutely vibrant.
It's an extraordinary place. It is really, you know, one of these wonderful places that you feel the desire to share with everybody, but then on the other hand, you don't want too many people going there. So it's really a very, but it was a very moving few moments in that particular place. And it's one of, you know, a few places I've visited in the world where you get a sense of some kind of not only the feeling that you can somehow spiritually belong to a landscape, but also that the true nature of this landscape is so far beyond anything you can ever hope to grasp, that your only desire is to try and paint it again and again and again to understand it better.
You know it. You know this this location, Alan. I take it. I saw you smiling and nodding.
Yeah, I know it very well. Yeah, it's one of my favorite places on earth. It's a little, quite a small patch of woodland on the moor beside a river, and the wood is actually quite kind of low, quite close to the ground. The trees don't really get much higher than about 20 feet or so, but they tend to kind of grow horizontally. And I think it's because of the high winds up there that they can't really, you know, stretch out and reach for the sky. So they just seem to kind of crawl along the ground, and it's full of moss-covered rocks, and a very, very atmospheric and beautiful place. And yeah, I've drawn there quite a lot.
Well, it's great to be introduced to it by this illustration, John. We've got a number of questions coming in, so I'm going to move on to look at a couple of Ted's illustrations at this point. And Ted, this image which we're going to see next, tell us where we are here.
Right, this is Amon Ruth, a mountain hideout basically for Mim the dwarf, and this is in the Turin story, the Narn. Turin and his band of sort of outlaws have captured the three dwarves, Mim and his two companions, and they have made them lead the party to their hideout to spare their lives. And so it was this particular image is based on a very small thumbnail, a very simple thumbnail, as sometimes happens. And then it was just a question of fleshing out the scene with lots of rock and trees and atmosphere. And I just enjoyed doing it very much. I love doing waterfalls and natural subjects like this. And one of the great things about Tolkien is you can have an image that has nothing to do with fantasy in the conventional way, and it's still as potent and as interesting. And I was just, I was proud of the fact that the flowers at the top of the mountain, at this hill, were reflected also in some of the shades that were used down below as well. And overall, I felt it hung together rather nicely, and it was very, very effective. So I was very proud to get this one through.
Well, I was looking at the description of Tolkien gives of the place, and he writes he writes at some length about it, but in one particular sentence he says, above the stony heath at its base its crown was reared up 1,000 feet and more upon the eastern side of broken land, climbed slowly up to high ridges among knots of birch and rowan and ancient thorn trees rooted in rock. And you've really captured that. And I wonder whether it's a fact that there is, in many of your illustrations, I think it's fair to say, there's a sense of your relishing the physical descriptions of places in Tolkien's writing. I mean, it's we were talking earlier about people versus place, but in all your illustrations, the dominance of place, and particularly mountains, is something which is very important to your style of artistry.
Yes, thank you so much. And that's true. That line about the 1,000-foot height, I think, was what grabbed me in particular. And then I went with that to try and express it. It's a very different looking Amon Ruth than I did in the Silmarillion, in fact, and which was another kind of, pleasure for me, was to be able to revisit that particular location like I did. And there, you could do several images from that description, as you say, as they're working their way up the mountain and then on into the other scenes that follow it. And it's funny with the mountains, because I was thinking how so many scenes in The Lord of the Rings take place around mountains or rocky kind of landscapes and things, fairly forbidding in some cases. And I was fortunate to be able to visit Switzerland twice in the last few years and explore some of the places that Tolkien himself went to as part of my friend's research into that, the 1911 trek that Tolkien went on. So we realized that there's a number of places that gave him inspiration, including Moria, the West Gate of Moria, a cliff rising out of a lake, and that's a place near Kandersteg. And I was able to use that in a recent illustration of the Fellowship, and as they approach Moria, and it just gave me great satisfaction to use the real location as and adapt that into the illustration itself. With some artistic license, actually.
I love the fact that all three of you are willing and able and feel free to be able to revisit images that you've created in the past. And that brings us to the next one we're looking at of your illustrations, Ted, which is He Beheld a Vision of Gondolin Amid the Snow. Now, this is an instance, a very particular instance, where looking at Tuor's arrival at Gondolin, where you revisited it, and in revisiting it, realized that there was an aspect of this particular scene which you hadn't captured before.
Yes, and I was wondering how on earth I had managed to not notice this up until now, but then I was rereading the Silmarillion account, and he describes the Vale of Tumladen as a green jewel. That is the descriptive used in the Silmarillion. So we have two different really accounts here of this moment. And at that time, it didn't occur to me that preceding that scene, they had passed the Pool of Ivrin, which was frozen and despoiled by Glaurung, and then frozen in the fell winter. So nothing has changed as far as the seasons go. However, the interpretation of this that I did years ago was based on the green jewel of Hutton. So I was rather thunderstruck when back in 2018, I reread this account for the first time of Tuor and the coming to Gondolin. And that word snow caught me, and I thought, well. So, that set me off. It was like, okay, we got a very wonderful possible image here, a beautiful image of fairy, potentially with almost monochromatic color. And I just thought dawn, the morning, the pink shades and blue shades and all of that stuff. And then add to that the scene that was actually described where all the various officials and people are there at this point in time.
Well, I think also one of the things about it is, although that you're seeing this enormous city of Gondolin from afar, really, because of the way the light is catching the city, and the way that you have those low remnants of morning clouds still hanging in the basin of the mountains surrounding it, really makes, although it's a long way away, gives you a real sense of the scale of the city.
Yes. I wanted to just definitely give it that epic feeling, the scale of it all, etc. it's a wonderful place to revisit. And yeah, I never get kind of tired of it.
I think it probably is the case with all of you that you are, you all experience discovering rather new things when you read the text, as indeed, of course, do all readers. While we're with you, Ted, we're going to look at a bonus image for those that for those of you who've tuned in. This is not in the book, but it is in the HarperCollins 2021 Tolkien calendar, which contains a selection of Ted Allen and John's art from Unfinished Tales, with, I modestly mention, an introduction from myself, and like the book, is available from Waterstones. So here we are on the high white peak, the mountain of Manwë. Tell me about this picture.
It is, simply speaking, an homage to Tolkien's watercolor of the same subject.
Yeah.
I was some years ago intrigued by the possibility of showing the sun and the moon in the same scene, and dealing with the potential light and effects that that might create. And so it hung on my wall for a long time, a full-size pencil drawing that had blown up. I'd blown up on and enlarged, and then finally I got my opportunity in the spring of 2018 when things had slowed down, and I thought, right, it's time to do this particular picture. And away I went, and it's based on two different color sketch versions, one more landscapey, the other one more vertical. I kind of came into a combination of the best of both of them. But it was just trying to create, you know, a sublime image that somewhat reflected the descriptions. And I had fun with especially the palaces at the top, which Varda and Manwë have their own separate residences, apparently very sensible, and to try to sort of indicate something like that, you know, for the viewer. Yeah.
Well, this image of Taniquetil is one that it's worth saying won you an award from the Mythopoeic Society last year, was it?
Yes,
2019?
2018.
Sorry, 18. And is just a remarkable piece, and you can see it in the calendar. It's not in the book, but that means you have to buy the calendar as well in order to see it. Lots of questions coming in, so I'm going to start having a look at some of those. Well, lots of people are saying thank you for your wonderful work to the three of you. Looking forward to seeing the book itself. A couple of people are asking what's your favorite, whether you have a favorite setting or scene to illustrate. I don't know whether any of you can answer that, or whether that's just the one you've just done. Anybody up for telling me if there's something, maybe something you haven't yet illustrated that you're itching to do? I think that's probably the case for John.
Oh, sure, I don't know. I'd like to bounce back about what Alan and Ted said about the wonderful aspect of such a vast, all-encompassing universe is that because there's no official version, there's also literally no interest in revisiting something you visited the same way. And each time you go back with nothing but the desire to try and do something new. And each illustration is a proposition. Each illustration, you know, is tied to the time you've done it in, your interpretation, your knowledge. And it's this capacity for a text which does not evolve to continue to inspire an evolution of vision. And I think that's one of the most exciting parts about Tolkien, is that it can constantly spurs you to try something new and different. And I could literally not, I mean, I've been asked many, many times, can I go back and repaint that Gandalf image that I did many years ago, the one that was stolen in that exhibition? I said, there's no way I'm going back to paint that. I did it once. I'm certainly not going to do it again, and probably less, you know, I mean, more poorly. So that kind of depth, I think, is one of the eternal attractions of Tolkien. And the fact that it's now gone through all of these iterations, illustrated editions, calendars, maps, movies, it's now become part of our shared culture. And therefore it's open to interpretation yet again and again and again. And I think that's probably why I would reply that the most exciting image, or the image I prefer, are the ones that the images I prefer are the ones that I haven't yet done.
Okay, that's a fair answer. A couple of people are asking if there's a favorite character that you have, or if not a character, perhaps a particular culture within the cultures of Middle Earth to which you feel attracted. Alan, do you have? Is there one there that you appeals to you perhaps more than another?
Well, I think it's got to be the elven cultures, really. It just appeals so much to, you know, because I've illustrated lots of books on fairies and other parts of our British mythologies, the Mabinogion, and I love Irish myths and legends. And I think the fact that Tolkien's elves are very much drawn from those kind of Celtic is very intriguing. And yeah, so I'm just fascinated by all the various elven realms, whether in caves, forests, or places like Rivendell.
There's a very specific question for you, Ted. The questioner asks, my favourite painting of yours is Luthien dancing in the forest in the blue dress. Is there a story behind its creation?
I suppose, I mean, at the time I was illustrating calendars, early 90s, I guess, and I wanted to include something from the Silmarillion and from Unfinished Tales in any of the calendars that I had the freedom to decide which artwork I would put in. So there was always Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, Unfinished Tales, and the Silmarillion, and I decided to do the Luthien. Actually was inspired by the Lay of Luthien scene in that, where she's dancing under the sunlight in a glade. In order to capture the pose, I was fortunate because I knew a couple of professional dancers, ballet dancers, and was able to get some photos of this woman, this friend of ours, and she was in this wonderful, wonderful pose, and she had very lithe, physique, etc. And all I had to do was, just kind of capture that and add the costume. And it was just fairly a great pleasure to do so, and just backing away enough that she's almost a bit further away, etc. And it just, yeah. Sometimes simple is best, I find, actually.
That's great. A couple of comments you'll be pleased to know. This is one for Alan, talking about the picture of the chance meeting. Bruce comments, rather than asks, but he comments that there is a dragonesque branch amongst that undergrowth around in the picture. I don't know whether you were consciously creating a dragonesque branch, but that's certainly as it's perceived.
Yeah, so it's one in every picture, I think.
Right. Okay.
It just win, yeah.
That's great. Is asking, this applies to everybody, but you don't need to answer, but I can answer it for you. But which is, will this event that we're on at the moment be eventually made available later as a recording? And yes, it will. So I suggest you check with Waterstones website and you will see that it will be available. But the answer to that is yes. I've been asked by Matt, what was there a particular moment or an incident where, when you were reading, going back perhaps to your first reading of Tolkien, when you were suddenly hooked on this whole concept of Middle Earth? Any of you? Alan? Alan?
Yeah, I think there was, and it was and I was 17 when I first started reading the books, and living in the suburbs of West London, essentially in Hillingdon, working in a cemetery, and really enjoying that kind of being on the edge of the green belt. So lots of woods, lots of rivers, lots of canals, and I just kind of imagine myself as an elf wandering around in this landscape. and I was a lot thinner then. Shot. Yeah, and it just felt like a fantastic resource, you know, a fantastic place to explore, and it affected my entire environment as well, and the way I viewed myself, and yeah, quite a bit of life change in a way.
Well, thank you. Ian asks, this is for you, John, that given that the fact that you said that working on the film has made you prefer landscape formats for working in, how glad should we all be, he asks, that widescreen wasn't used by Peter Jackson?
That's a good point. It's no, I think it's really about depth and scope, and I find that if you have the lateral leeway to place your action in such a way that it is not, whereas it should be the center of focus for the viewer, it's actually just next to it, and the center of focus becomes the landscape itself and allows the viewer in more deeply. And I find that very, very hard to do with landscape, with portrait formats. I find there's not that kind of anthropomorphic scope. But this said, I'm working on a book right now which is nothing but portrait format. So I'm simultaneously enchanted to be back in that format, but also very frustrated that I can't have more room to the left and right. But it really, yeah, I don't know. I just feel that every illustration should be an invitation, and it should allow the viewer to bring in whatever it is that he or she is bringing into that particular encounter. And I just find a portrait to be too restricting, unless of course you're focusing once again on a character. Then it's more powerful.
There's a question here which is primarily for Ted, I guess, but because I know John, although when I asked him a moment ago whether there was something that he would have liked to have done, and I know that this is a subject which he would like to have illustrated perhaps for this book had Ted not got there first, but I'm sure we'll do so eventually anyway, is the two blue wizards. And Kyle, who's asking this, asks, the enigmatic blue wizards, of course, feature the Astari section of Unfinished Tales, and Ted's illustration of them is the cover for the upcoming 2021 Tolkien calendar. It's also, incidentally, not just in the book itself, but it's also the slipcase design for the deluxe version of the book. He asks that given that they are only of the order not yet committed to film, which is true, and generally quite nebulous figures, also true, in Tolkien art, scarcely material on them on which to base a design. So he's asking whether, I wonder if the three artists felt a need or a desire to keep them absent, or at least distant in artwork to maintain that element of mystery. Well, Ted, you haven't kept them distant because you've now depicted them, but if you might like to say something about them, and then perhaps John and Alan will give us their view on why they haven't and whether they will one day commit the Blue Wizards to paper.
Of course, the history of this particular picture is that it stretches back some years, and I had designed a scheme of illustration thumbnails for Unfinished Tales. This isn't well known, I guess, just after the Silmarillion Illustrated came out, but it was decided to put it on the shelf to not continue with the idea. But I had developed a scheme for it, and one of the images was the Blue Wizards, and it was just, of course, a little pencil drawing. So in the scheme of things, I had an opportunity to turn it into a painting, and I was very much into the Patagonian landscape at the time. So I used that as the backdrop, kind of mountains inspired by that area of the world, and because of course it's very exotic and very far away and all that. So it was just a question of, well, we'll have these two figures who more or less look at what you might expect them to look based on Tolkien's limited descriptions, and have them just continuing into an unknown place, passing by, that sort of idea. And that's what I set out to do there.
Yeah.
Alan, what would you like to do an illustration of the Blue Wizards?
Well, as a matter of fact, I have done.
Oh, have
There's
you?
about a week during the filming of The Lord of the Rings when they were actually in the script.
Right.
We were going to see all 5 wizards appearing in Middle-earth on the shore.
But we haven't seen this yet, this image, no?
It was, no, they were just pencil drawings. So
Right.
we got as far as making some props, some stars,
Right.
mocking out some costumes and trying them on extras. And thankfully, the idea was dropped before it was committed to film. But it was, yeah, just one of those little kind of cul-de-sacs that we traveled down the Lord of the Rings films.
That's great. Well, you're not deterred, I take it, John, and one day you will give us your version of the Blue Wizards.
I definitely will. I really like Ted's painting of the that's in the calendar and the and the book. I think it's a great picture. I was, once again, that was one of the subjects that I immediately wrote back to the editor and said, I'd love to do the Blue Wizards. And he replied, I'm sorry, that one's done. Well, another time, but that's all right. It's another excuse to go back. I think that's it. It touches on the fact that Tolkien is almost more interesting when he doesn't say very much about something, because he provides this wonderful framework which gives you an emotional connection with the scene or the character or the situation, but he doesn't necessarily burden you with an overly detailed physical description. And then suddenly you are liberated to approach this kind of humble archetype that everybody's always searching for. And I think that's one of the things that I really like about that picture of yours, is this fact that these guys are really heading off somewhere very far away. I get that impression from the painting. They're not just out for an afternoon walk. They're, traveling to the other side of the earth. And, I think Tolkien, once again, like very few authors, affords this kind of liberation from obligation in order to concentrate on what's really essential, which is the feeling you're able to convey through all the accumulation of detail that you put in. And that freedom is precious, because there are so many authors, when you read what they've written, you think, oh my God, if I have to make a checklist of all this, there's nothing left for me in there. So that capacity of this wonderful series of texts to actually liberate artists and illustrators and people who are creative is quite
I think we're just losing your sound, John, there, but thank you for answering that. We look forward to seeing that image. Amongst the questions, many of them are, what are your favorite character, or who would you choose to spend be in Lock? Which Tolkien character would you like to be knocked down with? I don't know if you've got any response to that, many people are saying on the Q&A here just their thanks to the three of you, which of course I echo as well, for all the inspiration that you've given. Some people are commenting on the fact that they are themselves artists and they take so much inspiration from your great work, and other people just repeating again and again just how much pleasure they derive from your artwork. So I pass that on to you. I'm going to take the last question because it's so cheeky. It's from somebody called Chris, and Chris is asking if each of you could own an original Tolkien painting or drawing. Right, this is not one of yours or one of each other's, but one of Tolkien's original illustrations of drawings or pictures. What would it be?
Okay. No idea. Actually, there's a lot of great ones, but the Smaug on the treasure, would be
Or the
certainly-
conversation with Smaug.
Yes, Conversation with Smaug, or Bilbo Comes to the Huts of the Raft Elves. Absolutely love that one.
Right. John, Alan, you got any choices?
I'll have Bilbo Comes to the Huts of the Raft Elves, but can I have that in the form of a tapestry? Because there is a beautiful one that exists.
Indeed, yeah.
And yeah, that would be a real treat.
Good. Okay. Well, then I'm sorry, Ted. You'll have to make do with the conversation with Smaug. Do you want to put a bid in for anything, John?
I'm desperately trying to bring back to my memory all of Tolkien's work. I think the painting of the colored drawing of Rivendell.
Yes.
Because I've stood in that spot above Lauterbrunnen, and you can hold up the drawing and take a look and look at the mountains and decide more or less where he was. So that's there's this nice connection. I mean, it echoes what Ted said about visiting his the path of Tolkien's trek through the Alps in 1911. Is that this emotional connection to landscape, I think, is something that he captured not only in his writing but also in his art. So probably that one.
Okay, well, I wasn't specifically asked whether I wanted one by Chris, but since he seems to have an entree to these things, I'm going to put in a bid for the painting of Bilbo on the crag with the eagle, which I rather love. And none of you have chosen that, so I'll happily walk off that way. Before we all sail off into the west, because we're slightly overrunning our time for this event, but one last quick question to each of our guests here, and that is, your association with Tolkien's work has been long for all of you, and very in-depth and very involved and very committed. What has Tolkien's writing given to each of you, I mean, just for your personal satisfaction and as a creative artist? John?
Possibly the opportunity to wander around in a universe where literally everything is a pleasure to draw. Very rarely happens with authors. Often you will find that you're not in tune with something that they describe. And it seems with Tolkien, other than his habit of putting jewels on scabbards, which is the only thing I find difficult to do, all of the rest is extraordinarily enticing and attractive to try and visualize.
Thank you, Alan.
That pretty much sums it up for me as well. I think it's obviously been a fantastic thing to happen in my life. It was not something that I ever had any ambition about. I didn't really ever consider illustrating the Lord of the Rings when I was a student, even though I was, that was from my reading material. I could never envisage that I would end up illustrating the books. So it was just a beautiful sort of serendipitous journey for me to find myself able to, enjoy those books in so many different ways. It's not just illustrating a book; it's kind of a lifetime's relationship with a body of work, which I really appreciate.
Ted?
Yeah.
Yes, I would echo what these other two gentlemen have just said as well. And, what can you say? It's been an immeasurable influence on my world, my life, career. I can count myself as extremely lucky that I was able to read these books at an impressionable age as a teenager, and then to be so powerfully inspired that I'm still doing it and consider it a kind of a life's career, really, a vocation. To have that privilege has been wonderful to be able to communicate with fans as effectively and as long as I have. I never take any of that for granted. I count my blessings, and I feel very, very fortunate for all of it. And that Tolkien lived and wrote the way he did for all of us as well. What a gift.
And also a great gift from Christopher Tolkien.
Indeed, indeed.
The way that he's really cared for his father's work and expanded it, and just
Yes,
given us
an incalculable debt to Christopher.
Well, that's just to add, because you've said that, Alan. One of the things that has always impressed me about Christopher Tolkien's scholarship and editorship is the fact that he has, I would say, considering the body of the work that he has been responsible for giving to us, has maintained this through his life until the earlier this year when he left us, has always maintained this modest, unassuming role, and putting his father's work as absolutely being the most important and significant thing, and putting that forward and putting that first. And I think that level of curatorship, I can't think of a better word to apply to it, really is, I think, unparalleled and unprecedented, and as you say, Alan, absolutely something for which we have to be grateful. Each of you had, in your own ways, various interactions with him. I know, Alan, that Christopher said something very particular to you about your work.
Yeah, he said that what he liked about my work was that he felt it expanded his father's world. It just made it, it didn't change it, it just kind of made it feel larger, which was a lovely thing to say.
And John and Ted, your relationship with, I know there was obviously for both of you living not in England, or indeed where Christopher was living in France, but you both had interactions with him. How would you describe his legacy as the person who has made all this material so available to us? John?
I mean, I interacted very, very briefly and very little with him, very little contact, a brief exchange of telephone calls, and I think I have a letter somewhere. But once again, I think that his dedication to his father's writing is extraordinary, because not only did it preserve all of that for us as readers, it also clearly puts forward the fact that Middle-earth is an inclusive universe, in that it sends you constantly out of it in order to go and inspect Tolkien's own sources, which are vast. You know, being a historian, what's the word, a philologist? Yes.
Correct.
And all of that sends us off into the world, into history, into culture, and by that definition expands that universe even more. It's not one of these self-contained kind of universes. It reaches out into the world, into history, into general culture, and that's, you know, very exciting to be able to contribute to the visualization of that.
Thank you. Ted?
Yes, I agree with what John said about that very much. Christopher, for me, I had a wonderful cordial relationship with him during the Silmarillion. It's you know, he's probably the most knowledgeable, or was the most knowledgeable person about his father's work, and it was like working with Tolkien, or the next best thing to working with Tolkien himself. And he was very, very reasonable and cordial in everything we did. I think he was glad to be in kind of in a hands-on, one-on-one with the artist in this thing, and I thought it was extremely productive. He also influenced the 2004 edition by giving me an extra year, so that I was able to produce 20 new color pieces for that, and I will always be grateful to him for that as well. You know, but yes, what an extraordinary legacy, and thank goodness for his life and work.
Well, we all say amen to that. And there are so many people and many of them are members of the Tolkien Society and fans who know all four of us well in other contexts, who are sending greetings best wishes, people thanking Waterstones and HarperCollins for putting on this event, which is fantastic. But it's really time to call a halt, and I wanted to bring it back. Well, you have all, in talking about Christopher and his father, have done the task for me. I wanted to bring it back to the book itself, because in Tolkien's foreword to the second edition of The Lord of the Rings, he wrote that his prime motive for writing the book was, and here's the quote, "the desire of a tale teller to try his hand at a really long story that would hold the attention of readers, amuse them, delight them, and at times maybe excite them or deeply move them." Well, that he certainly did. And our three guests tonight have aided that process and extended it through their own lives and their work. And they're very, very often totally individual, but nevertheless equally inspired artistic visions. And we can see that once again in their contributions to this new edition of Unfinished Tales. So on behalf of all the people who have been commenting and viewing, and indeed all those people who know your work across so many years, thank you, John, Alan, and Ted very much. And from me, Brian Sibley, additional thanks to Edward Greenwood at Waterstones, and to Anne Bissell and Chris Smith at HarperCollins, and of course to all of you who've joined us for this special event. We hope you've enjoyed it. And after all of that, there's not much left for me to say other than Namarie.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.